Right, can I welcome you to the last session of this conference, the last session of today. Those of you who remember last year's conference may recall that we had Margaret Miller, who was our third Engelsberg professor at LSE IDEAS, wrapped up the last session. It was considered very successful. And so we thought we would repeat it in a slightly different form by bringing two extremely distinguished historians together to debate between themselves various aspects of history. And I read recently that in Genghis Khan's empire, historians were regarded as the lowest of the low. They were held in higher contempt than prostitutes, in fact. History is not quite as old a profession as prostitution. But since Herodotus, people have been listening to historians not only because they're interested in the past, but because they believe that historians are key to understanding the present and perhaps even anticipating the future. I should say that our two distinguished historians both managed to get the wrong luggage when they arrived. So you may question their competence today, but I don't think it has really any bearing.
On the contrary, both of us could have turned up if we'd not got our luggage back with frilly knickers on our heads, because we both had our luggage stolen by females. So, I mean, that would have...
No, I stole hers.
Well, it's still frilly knickers on our heads, which would have really consolidated the two English professors.
I got to the hotel that was full of a granny's clothes.
Oh, I would have looked better than you.
This suit was going round on its own.
I thought there was some of that.
Yes, the journal is already lost control. Can I introduce Michael Burleigh on my right, who is not only a distinguished historian, but is also a distinguished commentator of our present malaise and problems. He writes for many newspapers. His most recent book was Day of the Assassins, which is a history of political assassination, and he also wrote a book on populism, which were the lectures he gave to the Engelsberg professor. He was our first Engelsberg professor. We're delighted to have him today. And Dominic Lieven is one of the most distinguished professors of Russian history. Was also taught at the LSE. Michael taught at the LSE for a time. And most recently has been a senior research fellow at Trinity College in Cambridge. And his most recent book is on emperors, which is the history of 2,000 years, 5,000 years emperors. So, very broad ranging. The idea is that I will ask some questions to which I hope will get some coherent answers, and occasionally, as you can see, with the badinage just now, our historians will engage each other. Can I begin with a quotation by a very distinguished American historian, Israeli historian of the Holocaust, Ratiu, who said historians are generally better at studying the past than anticipating its return. And the theme of this conference, this session, is the return. So I would like them both to start by sharing their thoughts on Ukraine and the return of history. And remember, the war in Ukraine began with a historical essay, not peer-reviewed, it has to be said, by Vladimir Putin. Michael,
When Christopher said something about historians being prostitutes,
I didn't say that. I said no.
My mind immediately went to the first emperor in China, who had one historian castrated and buried alive to 426 others who got the history of the battle wrong in his eyes, so they were buried alive. Anyway, I mean, the idea of a return of history is as preposterous as the idea of an end of history. Where does history go to come back? So these are just nonsense notions. They're the sort of thing you write a clever essay in the Foreign Affairs magazine that goes all over the place. And, you create a brand, Frankfurt Yama brand, in the case of the end of history. So that's nonsense. I've got no particular wisdom on the war in Ukraine. I guess as a historian, you watch these things unfolding in real time, and as a historian, you think, well, what does this remind me of? And I've just jotted down a few things which it does remind me of. First of all, in a very remote way, 19th century German, Russian, other campaigns to Germanize or Russify populations who are not willing to be part of their empire. So that would involve interfering with the school system, banning languages. That's also true of the Ukrainian, of course. The obliterated it as a language. So that's the first thing. The second thing it very much reminds me of, thinking in particular of Putin's attempts to bring into existence plebiscitary pseudo-statelets in the Donbass. This reminds me very much of what happened at Brest-Litovsk, where, as you know, there were two treaties, one in February 1918, the other one in March. The first one being with Ukrainian nationalists in the Rada Council, the second one being with the Bolsheviks. And the Germans, we often think about national self-determination and think of Woodrow Wilson, but actually the Germans were way ahead of that game in terms of national self-determination. They called into existence, for their own instrumental and economic reasons, an independent Ukrainian state. They tried to create pseudo-states in Lithuania and in Belarus, but that didn't really work because of the sort of general retardation of political culture. And then they were going to put German princes in power in places like the Duchy of Kurland in the Baltics, and created series of buffers push Russia back, as it were. And of course, don't forget that they were responsible, the Germans, for perhaps the greatest act of political subversion I can actually think of, which was to help Lenin on his way on the train to Russia. And if you think about it, it's so extraordinary that to put all your chips onto a tiny party, which, you know, for an outsider, you think they're never going to come to power, but somebody there did think that. And lo and behold, they did eventually depose the provisional government and carry out the Bolshevik Revolution. It's an extraordinary piece of political subversion. It must be almost unique in its efficacy. So that's another thing I would say this reminds me of. So that's that. By the way, the Rada state didn't last very long. It was dominated by socialists, of course, so at that point the Germans got rid of it and put the hetman Skoropadsky in power instead. It was much more reactionary and aristocratic and amenable to their wishes. What they wanted, of course, was just to plunder the place for grain and industrial raw materials. The other thing that the First World War seems to me to have some bearing on this is that in the First World War did not stop in 1918 with a lot of peace treaties. It just debouched into a series of extremely vicious civil wars. And some of those states decided to ethnically cleanse, as we would say in modern jargon, the existing populations. And of course, the most striking example would be the mutual expulsions of Greeks and Turks in the 1920s, not to mention the 1915 Armenian genocide, where they just wiped out a prosperous and unwanted minority who they blamed as a sort of fifth column. And interestingly, if you go and read the German press, this is just a slight diversion, but I'm going to do it. If you read the German press in the 1920s in the Weimar Republic, you will be astonished to see that for every article on Mussolini, who after all would become Italian Prime Minister in 1922, there are probably 25 to 50 articles about Kemal Ataturk in the German press. And the reason for that is because, one, he had destroyed an Allied peace treaty, the Treaty of Sèvres, and the Allies were forced to renegotiate it as the Treaty of Lausanne, so he won, effectively. And secondly, he created a much more ethnically homogeneous Turkey, dominated by Turks, and got rid of everybody else in it. So in the eyes of many Germans, this was the way to go. Plus, of course, he was a modernising military autocrat. So terrific coverage of Ataturk in Turkey. Nobody ever thinks of Nazis and Ataturk, but there was a very definite connection. Anyway, that's that digression. As for moving populations, well, obviously World War II was an enormous experiment in population transfers, including killing people, of course, in large numbers. And there are some pretty direct things which do remind me of what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. For example, they've kidnapped, apparently, according to yesterday's Financial Times, about 20,000 children, just abducted them and taken them to Russia to bring them up as Russians, which of course is an outrageous war crime, and to generally try to destroy Ukraine's sense of itself and its sense of statehood. So this is obviously very similar to what we saw in World War II. Although whether the trouble with all the Hitler analogies, and as a 68-year-old man, I can tell you that starting off when I was 1, every enemy of Britain, when I was 1, it was Colonel Nasser in Egypt, Hitler, in our crass, vulgar, belligerent press. Then it was the Argentinian generals, Hitler. Then it was Saddam Hussein, Hitler. Then it was Gaddafi, Hitler. Then it was Assad in Syria, Hitler. The Iranian mullahs, Hitler. I mean, my God, get a life. And then any reasonable attempt to negotiate with any of these people, who certainly were not in charge of big industrial, powerful states like Germany, any attempt to resolve problems diplomatically is appeasement. In fact, the only article I've ever written in a British newspaper which they spiked was when I decided to write quite a sophisticated article about appeasement, saying it was quite a logical thing to do. If you had enemies in Japan and with Italy, the Mediterranean, and the Germans, you would have to pick your enemy and who you're going to fight, so you'd have to do a deal with one, to not face all three. They wanted me to print that. Even though the paper concerned had been a big advocate of appeasement back in 1938. Guilty conscience. Anyway, this brings me to the why of it all, and I'm sure you know most of what I'm just going to say. I mean, Putin himself seems to me to be a sort of mediocre secret policeman. And his KGB career was hardly distinguished. He was in a sort of peripheral outpost in Dresden for much of his life. He wasn't with the 200 sort of top KGB people in East Berlin. That's one thing. He's obviously got the same inherent conspiratorial mindset of people in that line of work. He thinks the world is out to destroy Russia. He also suffers from something that he's not unique in this, a fixation on what he would call the Great Patriotic War, which Russian television is as bad as Amazon or Netflix in Britain, that is sort of wall-to-wall Hitler every night. And I wonder, who are these men who come back from the pub, semi-drunk, and want to watch sort of tanks invading Russia in 1941? What's wrong with them? And it's like it's on a loop every night, this stuff. And Russian television is even worse. And then, as Christopher alluded to, Putin has taken last July, I think it was last year, he took to offering his thoughts about history. I suspect he didn't write it himself. It's like Gazprom pays for a big touring sort of exhibition of Russian history, according to the regime. It's one of the many services Gazprom provides. Now it's turning its security guards into soldiers to deploy in Ukraine. So there we are, the Gazprom view of history. But it was actually his personal confessor who wrote the content of the exhibition that's in every Russian town. You can go and see it. This is his version of Russian history. Anyway, it's a very sort of typical, I think the trendy youth word for how he writes history, it's a mashup. Like music, a mashup, it's kitsch. It's not history like Dominic or I do it, it's a mashup of stuff. So obviously he deprecates the Bolsheviks, Lenin, Trotsky, etc. as state destroyers. They destroyed the Russian state. He thinks Kerensky was a weakling, the Tsar, ditto Nicholas II, another weakling. But he goes back to the strong Tsars, Peter the Great obviously, but also particularly Alexander III. He's put about 8 statues up of Alexander III all over Russia, who was an ultra-nationalist. This was a tough guy, ultra-nationalist, big, strong, horse-riding, tough guy. And then he, to come on to something that Christopher wrote a very fine book about, the civilizational state, which I genuinely think you should all read. He comes back to the supposed unique properties of the Russian world, that it's an orthodox world that has particular characteristics. The life of the steppe and of the Mongols is integrated into it. It's a very composite thing. And that also involves, of course, denying the existence of all pre- and post-imperial peoples within the empire. So, that's the essence of what he wants to create, this sort of kitsch view of the past, which means that the Ukrainians aren't allowed the past at all. They're a fiction, so to speak. And then, as far as his modus operandi is concerned, lies, force, and murder are entirely normative in Russia, and I I just mentioned earlier on the film Leviathan, which seems to be a remarkable depiction of what happens to you if you cross powerful people, how the whole state, including the Orthodox Church and the courts, just destroys you, just ruins your life, and then steals your house in the case of the man in the film. And then he doesn't believe at all in any sort of international legal order that doesn't serve the interests of Russia, so that's all nonsense in his eyes too. Now, historians can do surprisingly little, I think, to counter any of this, although one of the positive byproducts of what we've been living through is an explosion of interest in the history of Ukraine, some very good people writing about it. But that has to sort of go against the patterns that have been set up by academia in the societies concerned. So when I was a student, French history was big. Then it got entirely displaced, happily, just at the time I got my PhD, by German history. Russian history was pretty strong because there was a lot of Cold War investment in teaching people Russian for obvious reasons, and then Russian history became a big thing. The right-wing Polish diaspora has a presence in our historical culture. People like Adam Zamoyski, whose great-great-grandfather was involved in the assassination of Poland's first democratically elected prime minister in 1921. But anyway, there are lots of fairly right. I never met a Polish historian who's a socialist, one I think, but you never really meet that. What I'm saying is that suddenly maybe the history of Ukraine and other adjacent countries will come through and become a much bigger thing, as current events drive historical interest and it gets entrenched in the system. I mean, German history was so institutionalized. I made some television documentaries in the 1990s, and without presenters, I hasten to add. But in the 20 years after that, the television industry in Britain was flooded by young Germans who came over to be producers, or first of all to be interpreters, but then who became producers of documentaries on the Nazis, and then rose up in the television industry to become quite powerful players as producers. It's quite extraordinary, like outdoor relief for young Germans in our television. There's some ironies in that. Anyway, I don't have any illusions that this war is going to stop, even though, of course, we can all see that the so-called $60 billion a year military modernisation of Russia was a nonsense, because I suspect half of it was stolen by corrupt generals and corrupt officials. So their performance on the battlefield, their armaments, is a disaster. I mean, just think about this: if a superpower has to buy pretty crappy drones from Iran, it doesn't have much of a defence industry. That's just extraordinary, isn't it? So it's not going to stop. It's going to go on as a long industrialised military slog with the West acting as proxies, and that in turn will depend how long the West is prepared to put armaments and money into Ukraine, will very much depend on political factors. So, for example, were the next American president in November 2024 to be the president from a jail cell, which, as we all know, is technically possible, he can be president from a jail cell. They might even put him under house arrest in the White House. Then I would say very much so that all the bets are off as far as American support for Ukraine are concerned, because as we all know, certainly lots of Republicans and probably lots of Democrats are gagging to have the war with China that they want. They regard this as just an unnecessary distraction from the big war that they really want to fight, which is against China, because they really fear China in a way that they don't fear Russia. Americans, we might fear Russia because we're near. I don't think Americans fear Russia, they just regard it with the same level of contempt that the Chinese regard it as. Don't believe anything the Chinese say publicly about Russia. So it won't stop. The big danger for Ukraine, the really big danger for Ukraine, I would say, just off the top of my head, with some thought, is that there could be attempts to come to some diplomatic resolution, which would have to first of all revolve around a ceasefire. Fair enough, you might say, that sounds reasonable. But what I fear is that it would be coupled with some much bigger resolution of the whole security architecture involving the West and Russia, And there could be a danger that the first proposition, the sort of peace that Zelensky and his government get, will suffer because of the overwhelming desire of the West to come to some long-term. Russia is not going anywhere. There it is. If it broke up, it would be an almighty cataclysm. I wouldn't even like to think about it. So that second element of that could well overshadow the first part of it. This is the danger of what will go on. And then pressure, especially if Western arming of Ukraine were to fall off, then the pressure would be on the Ukrainian government to come to some territorial resolution in why on earth they should give away 20% of their territory, or any fraction of it beyond need, but that's what would probably ensue. So that's what I would really worry about if I was a politician in Ukraine at present, would be that happening. And I also worry if many of these right-wing populist parties who are basically admirers of Putin because he's tough, if more and more of them come to power across Europe, and that could either result from an economic downturn, or, much more likely, I suspect, the type of mass rising against the economic costs of greening our economies. I think that's a real danger coming on the horizon, that there's a sort of reaction against the green stuff. Then if those parties come to power, they have a very dodgy track record. It wasn't so long ago that Salvini in Italy was walking around with some Putin as God or something on a t-shirt. These are people you really want to worry about if they get into power. And unfortunately, I don't think we've seen the last of any of them. If you look around Europe, it's quite like the next Spanish government will be a combination of conservatives and Vox supporting conservatives. This could happen everywhere. So, no, I don't think there's an end of history, and no, I don't think there's a return of history. It's just there in all its mess. And I'm not a clairvoyant, I'm not a prophet, and there you are.
Well, thanks for cheering us up. And now we will move on. I have 2 questions I want to ask you, but Dominic first, please.
Yes, I'm afraid I'm not going to add to the general feeling of happiness. 1991, the end of history. I think most great empires, most great civilizations, we would call them, think they're the end of history. The Western, this is particularly the Americans, were not unique in that. What I think is perhaps not unique, but unusual, is the speed with which the illusion has collapsed from the triumphalism of the 1990s to the gloom and doom of today is just in 20 years rather exciting. I mean, my sense as a historian of what's gone on in Ukraine is very much geared to the work I've done, less on Russia specifically than on empire. And in this particular case, on the end of empire and its consequences. I mean, although what is happening now is awful and was certainly not inevitable, I still, on the whole, in historical perspective, I'm less surprised by what is happening now than that it didn't happen back in 1988 to 92. Of course, there are specific reasons which we understand about why it didn't happen, but even so, the basic point is that the end of empires is usually associated with huge-scale conflict. International wars, the 2 world wars, which were significant degree caused by the end of empire, were linked to the end of empire. Civil wars, the whole bloody lot. I'm not going to begin arguing whether the Soviet Union was an empire. That's a damn stupid question. It all depends on your definition, which in turn is linked to your ideological position. For me, the Soviet Union had the key ingredients of empire. It was vast, it was multinational, and it was extremely powerful. The basic point is that when empires collapse, that means the disintegration of great powers which are enormously important in the international system. Well, they wouldn't be called empires, not at all. Well, the disintegration of a power like that causes tremendous ructions. It causes insecurity, temptation, humiliation, etc. Look, the First World War was to a very significant degree to do with decline and possibly impending collapse. It least in the eyes of contemporaries, of the Ottoman, then Habsburg, to some extent even Romanov empires. The end of empire also means that empires which are conglomerates of people, often living cheek by jowl, have to be turned into nation states with hard borders. Almost always you have tremendous battles over those borders, etc., etc. Thirdly, as long as you're sitting in an empire, and to some extent, within a Marxist-Leninist system, nationality is of secondary importance. The people are not sovereign. Once the people are sovereign, you begin arguing about who the people are or aren't. And that is usually to do with definitions drawn from history and ethno-linguistic consequences, mayhem. And it is certainly also true that on the whole, the consequences of the collapse of land empires are even more catastrophic than the consequences of the collapse of the West European transoceanic empires. For all sorts of reasons, the most basic of which is that the metropolitan power is still in the game. It is likely still to be the most powerful state in the region, and all the resentments that it feels for its collapse of status, which go along with the end of empire, and all the border disputes are still involving the metropolitan power. So it remains, to my mind, less surprising what's happening now than what didn't happen then. One way of thinking of this is the collapse of the British Empire, which on the whole was better managed than the collapse of French, Dutch, etc., most of the other transoceanic empires. We nevertheless are still living with the consequences of the British Empire's collapse, all the way from the Irish dispute to Fiji. Among the issues still going strong are Cyprus, Palestine, Iraq, and probably most serious of all, India-Pakistan over the Kashmir issue. That is now, 80 years since the collapse of the Raj. It has now reached the level of nuclear confrontation. Added to the pressures of climate change on politics in the subcontinent, it could have catastrophic consequences a century after the breakup of empire. A point to note as well in connection with British Empire is that it can actually take a generation or more for the consequences of empire's collapse to really come home to roost. Minor example, it was a generation, for instance, before Buddhist integral nationalism took over the government of Sri Lanka. More to the point, it was a good generation after the partition of India that Bangladesh, seceded amidst enormous war suffering, you name it. I think, the obvious conclusion to draw from that is, and this is to agree with Michael, I'm afraid in a boring way, I do not find it at all inconceivable, if the world still exists, to think that the Ukrainian-Russian dispute will still be there in 80 years' time. I do not mean that there will be continual war, as there has not been continual war between India or Pakistan, as there has not been continual war even between the Israelis and their Arab neighbours. No, you will have ceasefires, you will have freezes, but you will have a continuing ratcheting up of tensions and armaments which burst into full-scale conflict periodically. That, I think, I'm afraid, is the likeliest scenario. That entails, of course, the remilitarization of Europe, apart from other things. If you're looking for parallels, you can find them all over. One, obviously, is the German between the wars. The basic point, I think, in 1919, just as in 1991, is that Germany and Russia are the losers from the territorial settlement, but they remain latently much the most powerful states and communities in the region. It is not any more unjust that the powerful should feel that the most cheated, but it's certainly dangerous. It took a generation for Germany to come back. It has taken a generation for Russia to think it has regathered its strength. This is not to compare Putin to Hitler, which is, I think, remains a silly comparison. Hitler was a man, of course, of utter evil, but he was also in a certain way an evil genius. And he was also an exceptionally powerful demagogue. Putin is a minor bureaucrat who's been largely by accident catapulted to the top of the state system. But you've got, you can find parallels. There are fascist elements certainly coming through in Russia now. But it's not the same thing, but it doesn't need to be for by comparison, because I think the German elites in time would have challenged the Versailles settlement in the East even without him. So again, there's nothing particularly cheerful with this. As to Putin and his, great historical piece, actually, I wish it had been just some underling and whether the man actually wrote it. He did spend a lot of time sitting in isolation, reading history, Russian history. There's nothing more fatal than third-rate minds reading history on their own and getting that confirmed, of course, in an echo chamber. No one's going to tell him he's wrong, but apart from the fact that he was almost in isolation during the pandemic. I mean, what he said is actually, this is fascinating for a historian, he's completely repudiated the Soviet model, Soviet nationalities model, loathes Lenin. He is now putting forward the ideology of the monarchy, the pre-1914 monarchy, and of the White Counter-Revolution. Russia, one great and indivisible. And look, I am a child of the monarchy and of the white immigration. My great-uncle commanded a brigade in Udenich's White Army. I can see where they're coming from, but this was over 100 years ago. And actually, even my great-uncle had the intelligence to realise that if they were going to fight the Bolsheviks, they had to come to terms with non-Russian nationalism. The point is that his comments about Russia and Ukraine being one people would have made excellent sense in 1850, and most educated Ukrainians would have agreed. Already by 1940, who were educated Ukrainians? They were the nobility exclusively. That didn't mean they didn't have a sense of Ukrainian separate identity, but it was like people in, the elite in Yorkshire would have a sense of Yorkshire as a very interesting separate identity. Wouldn't have crossed their minds to think it could be an independent country. That's pushing it a bit far. It was like that. By 1940, you're into a different world. You've already, by now, got the Ukrainian issue, I think, building up into what is the most important geopolitical issue in Europe. The basic point, and this is to come back to where Michael started, if the Germans had not brought the Americans into the First World War on the very eve of the revolution taking Russia out, I think the Germans had a strong chance of winning the First World War on points. All they needed was stalemate in the West and Brest-Litovsk in the East. No independent Ukraine could exist except as a German protectorate at that time, which does not at all mean that independent Ukraine was illegitimate, or that in time a Ukrainian state, initially a German protectorate, couldn't have turned into a perfectly viable nation state. Ukraine was a much more viable potential nation state than the British protectorate of Iraq. Here again, we are living with the consequences of the First World War. The British created that protectorate to control Mesopotamian oil. The point about Ukraine in 1914-18 is that this is not merely enormously important in demographic and other terms, but at that time, Ukraine is the centre of the Russian Empire's export agriculture, its iron and coal industry, and to a considerable extent, its metallurgical industry. Without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be a great power. Without Russia as a great power, Germany in principle dominates Central and Eastern Europe, and therefore in principle dominates all Europe beyond the Rhine, to the east of the Rhine. And on balance, I actually tend to think it would have been better if the Germans had won the First World War. I think we would live in a better world. But all these things are whatever. And are not strictly relevant now, except to the fact that with all its nastiness and German policy in the East in and Germany in general in 1914-18 is very nasty. It is still a gulf from Hitler. It is absolutely illegitimate to say how wicked of Ukrainians to collaborate with Germans in the First World War, remembering what happened in the Second. That's nonsense. Quite apart from anything to do with the fate of the Jews in Eastern Europe, the Germans tended to regard them as second-rate citizens, but almost honorary Germans and a hell of a lot above the Slav peasantry. Yeah. So we've got all of those things, Putin is an example of how not to use history. And I think I will stop here. I was about to tell an anecdote, but I won't. Look, my great grandfather, my grandfather used to own the town and the mines. And that is not just a literal anecdote, because it tells you something about the dangers of reading the present into history and using history just as a source of ammunition. American-style political correctness. You pick a bit out of history and you use it in the battle between the wokes and the ignoramuses. It was my great-grandfather, Grand Russian, which of course they were, well, even less in Ukraine. These are cosmopolitan aristocrats who speak 7 languages. Their main estates are at the other end of the empire, in the Baltic. Fine. What about the other end of the spectrum? The peasantry is not Russian or Ukrainian or anything. They're peasants. Their mentality is local to the extent they have broader mentalities, they're religious. This is not to say something about Ukrainian peasants, it's to say something about pre-modern peasants in general. To the extent that they have a political identity beyond the local, it is often monarchist, because the monarch is the protector of the Orthodox community and some kind of idealized version of justice in a horrendously exploitative and cruel world. Who are the people? Of course, my great-granddad didn't develop Donetsk as the centre of the Russian Empire's coal industry. No, he let it to this Welshman called Hughes. The skilled workers were Hughes as well, Welshmen as well. So reading history back into the present is bloody silly. And of course, for a historian, extremely annoying. And I'll shut my mouth.
Can I just add a couple of things? You made a very good point about the German army in the First World War. I mean, when German troops came into the sort of East European shtetls with their Ostjugend inhabitants, they were so fascinated they took to sort of drawing and photographing them. They thought, this is really interesting. And because they spoke Yiddish, they could actually vaguely communicate with them in a way they certainly couldn't with any of the surrounding Ukrainian or whatever peasants. So the whole attitude was that if you think, 20 years later that it killed a lot of them, that was not the case in 1914-18. The second point I'd like to add to your praise for cosmopolitan aristocratic culture. The only people who made a serious effort to bring the First World War to a conclusion were Austrian aristocrats who usually had relatives who were aristocrats in France, Bourbons or whatever, and then obviously in Austria itself. They ran into the minor problem that their big brother partner wasn't interested. But then even the Pope, who tried a serious peace initiative in whenever it was, Benedict the 15th, he was an Italian aristocrat. These were people who've got relatives in every country, who were Nazi. So the only people who could actually do the peace talk, as it were, behind the scenes, and they usually met in Switzerland to try and break these deals, were European aristocrats. I'm afraid that's just historical fact.
Often you will have villas in Baden-Baden.
Yes.
And Max von Baden, the last chancellor, of course, from the Baden royal family, was one of the key interlocutors. No footnotes, please. No footnotes. That's one of the joys of age when you become a historian. We've always had to try and tell history, but when you get older and you get footnotes, there's always that temptation to improve, absolutely.
Now, Great Patriotic War. I want your views on that. And Anthony Beevor's book, Berlin, 1945, is banned in Russia. His book, Stalingrad, was investigated by the Russian army for historical errors. John Keating's book on the Normandy landings, in which he described Normandy as the greatest military disaster Hitler had suffered up to that point, meant that all his books were withdrawn from Russian schools and libraries. Stalin, as you know, is considered the greatest Russian who ever lived, and the Great Patriotic War is considered the greatest event in 900 years of Russian history. And Putin uses it, as do Russian nationalists all the time. What is your position on the Great Patriotic War as myth rather than its history? Is it helpful? If you were Russian, is it helpful? Is it not helpful? Is it being used quite cynically?
Oh, I'm sure they believed it, but it could also be quite cynical. Well, I think the problem with it is what it leaves out. I mean, if you think of American and British soldiers on beaches in Normandy, they were quite disconcerted to find out that a lot of the German prisoners they were capturing were in fact members of Vlasov's Russian Liberation Army, and filled up prison camps back in Britain with these unfortunate people who then, after minimal deliberation, we then handed back to Stalin, who then machine gunned on the docks as they got off the ships. So that wasn't a happy episode. And then also, of course, Great Patriotic War involved the deportation of all the Germans, of the Chechens who found themselves in far Siberia, Crimean Tatars, even how many people died in those sorts of journeys. So it's got a very complex history. But I think it is the point where the Russian state, as it were, made its accommodations with the Orthodox Church. So you get a monastery paying for a tank regiment, and the patriarchs are the blessers of troops and all the rest of it. So that was a happy moment for the Orthodox Church, who the Bolsheviks had tried to annihilate them before that. So I guess that, yes, it's somebody, a very famous historian in Cambridge, I'm sure Dominic would know, once said that if you think of the timbers in a boat or a house, that historians were like woodworm. Mm-hmm. That's what we do, we're the woodworm people, in the sense that we disintegrate. If you've got woodworm in the table, we turn the table from solid to powder, we dissolve everything. I prefer to see it more like you grit in your eye, that we just temporarily disturb your visual sense by saying something that we probably shouldn't do that. So that's my view on the great patriotic war.
Okay. I'd like to take up woodworm first. I mean, the great thing is in the 19th century, historians were loved by government.
Yeah. Because
we created national myths. And that, frankly, this is what we were talking about yesterday, civic education. Now, of course, professional historians spend the whole time undermining national myths, and governments hate us. So we're not nearly as well subsidised as we used to be. As for the Second World War, look, I think at a certain level there are some parallels with the English, or even if you can still talk about the British. The Second World War was the last moment when the British could be unequivocally proud of their state, themselves, their victory. And in popular culture, the Second World War is still there. So multiply that by 100 times and you've got the Russian equivalent. But of course, in a way that is not true in Britain, or at least minimally true, the Soviet and now the Russian authorities play this, milk this, etc., etc., etc. It resonates because, of course, the Russian people, and indeed the other peoples of the Soviet Union, suffered appallingly. There is no doubt that vast numbers of not just Russians, but other Soviet citizens, both had an extremely emotional attitude, entirely justifiably, to the Second World War. Many of their families had been killed, and had a sense of triumph in victory. And that was, I think, probably the strongest source of legitimacy of the Soviet regime by the 1980s. Early Marxism is essentially dead. And that remains true now. It's being, churned up and churned up and churned up like this. It is interesting and scary that the younger generation, to a significant degree, has taken this up in just the same way that it's rather scary that the younger generation in China seems to be more inclined to swallow anti-Japanese propaganda and mythology about the Second World War than was the older generation, which often just wanted to forget about it. So, there are dangers here. But of course, but what Michael said, look, Stalin was extremely lucky that the Soviet Union was invaded by Hitler. Unbelievably, Hitler was even worse than Soviet propaganda had painted Western imperialism. And his failure, his failure to mobilise an anti-Soviet feeling, both in the non-Russian nationalities and even among Russians, was catastrophic. But of course, he was Hitler.
But the other thing that's worth, the Red Army, in which incidentally 2 million Ukrainians serve, yes, they did undoubtedly liberate Berlin and so on, just put a really finishing blow to that regime. But don't forget that it was that regime's mistakes at the start, not to mention the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the division of Poland between the two of them, with happy NKVD people happily cooperating with SS officers as they met on the border. Not unique, by the way. I was very surprised to learn from somebody who knows that there were 20 NKVD officers on secondment to SOE in London during the Second World War. Nobody knows that. NKVD officers cooperating with the British spooks and subversives, because of course they needed to be able to access Communist Party underground movements in occupied Europe, so the Russians knew who to deal with. So that's I actually found that quite surprising. But so anyway, the regime which managed to dismantle one lot of advanced fortifications without then properly building the second set, then was surprised that German tanks just went over them like a knife through butter. I mean, what a catastrophic thing to do. And then Stalin had all the German deserters, because with 3 million troops and lots of deserters every night, he just had them shot. They were saying, look, you're going to be attacked at dawn tomorrow. No, bang. And they were shot. Quite extraordinary.
Do you want to say something about public history on this, at this point?
Yes, I will say something about public history, because I had a bizarre experience starting in 2013, where I was asked to be part of the government commission to commemorate the First World War. And the Cameron government put £55 million into this to go down to 2018. The implicit agenda was that, of course, it started a year before the Scottish independence referendum, so it was designed to show that we're all happy with our devolved governments as one united people. That was what was really going on beneath the surface, but never mind. So there I found myself on a panel of about 20 people. We met once a month to look at all aspects of how Britain was going to commemorate this big event in its national life. And these were retired politicians, very senior admirals, generals, air vice marshals, another historian of the First World War. And we set to work about this. So the first ominous word was when some liberal politician said, we're responsible, we're the guardians of the tone. Oh dear, we're not going to upset anybody. And then we weren't going to discuss the causes of the First World War at all. That was verboten, lest the Germans object. That was out. We were going to include Russia as one of the three Entente powers, Britain, France and Russia, on the Allied side. But of course the events of 2014 meant that Russia was no longer an actor. We had a problem with the Americans because they're not in the slightest bit interested in World War I. It's not part of their consciousness. Their government wouldn't put a penny into any of this. Then we had to tread very carefully with our Turkish friends. We had to be very, very delicate with the Irish because they had a rebellion and revolution in 1916, so that had to be whatever. And anyway, month after month, I would just put my hand up and say, yes, but are we going to do something about these commanders who were in charge of these battles? And there was a deadly silence from all the generals. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't up being provocative. I really wasn't. I just wanted to know, 700,000 people die here, 1 million people die there. I'd quite like to know what's going on in the minds of the people who sent them to get killed. How do they plan these battles? No, we weren't going to do that. And the reason wasn't because of embarrassment or that they screwed up. Some did, some didn't. It was because the whole thing was designed to show little Johnny, aged 12, what his great-grandfather did on the Somme. So it was all designed with the view of children in mind. So we weren't going to do anything vaguely complicated like that. Nothing on the diplomacy of the war, which was constant. Nothing on how the war ended, although one air marshal put his hand up and said, shouldn't we be at least saying that it was a strategic defeat, because we had to go back and fight it again 20 years later. Deadly silence. And this is public history. And then the absurdity of all the political stuff going on. We had to find the one black African-American sailor who drowned in a troop ship that went down off the Shetlands or something, and then do his grave up. This is the whole thing. Some of it, the cultural programme, was quite interesting. There were some quite moving things like people in military uniform popping up in a railway station, handing you a card, and it said who you were, what you did as a civilian occupation, and where you got killed. And that's quite a clever thing to do. So that was inventive. But the whole thing was an extraordinary exercise in how the official mind of a government does some big historical event, and that will happen in country after country, I suspect.
Can I put something in there, Christopher? Because 1914 is one of my obsessions. I've written 2 books about it. Look, to put things cruelly, I think if the British had had more sense, there wouldn't have been a First World War. Or maybe if they hadn't been British. If the British deterrent to Germany had been credible and sufficient, I think the Germans would have backed down. In the winter of 1213, the German Foreign Ministry went to the Prussian German General Staff and said, look, you go through Belgium, you're going to bring the British in, back off, think of another plan. To which the German General Staff responded, A, the British army is too small to matter, B, the British will come in anyway, and C, by the time they come in and matter, we'll have won the war, etc. Credible deterrence would have required a defensive military alliance with France, conscription, and a unilateral guarantee of Belgium. Great. The trouble was this was completely inconceivable in terms of British politics. But of course that kind of issue was never discussed in the Centenary. Despite the fact that in not merely have we got the history of appeasement in the 1930s, I am absolutely with Michael, I hate this bloody word appeasement. People, if you go all the way back to ancient Chinese and ancient Indian thinkers, Arthur Shastra, they talk about appeasement. Sometimes appeasement makes very good sense. But you've got to make sure you're appeasing someone who is appeasable. It doesn't mean all appeasement is wrong. The English appeased the Americans like mad in the 1880s and 1890s and early 20th century, and it turned out gold. They allowed themselves to be insulted and rolled over because they knew they had to have the Americans on their side. It worked sometimes. It didn't work in the 30s. Labour voted against conscription in 1939. All of this reflects a basic public ignorance about international security, international relations. So 100 years after the First World War, are you going to even attempt to draw any lessons? No, you're going to turn history into Disneyland.
Actually, the Labour Party conference in 1938 voted to abolish the law of efforts.
Well, exactly.
A little more than I said.
If I could jump, this was the last thing I said. Look, the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact was an alliance of evil regimes, deeply evil, and it was also turned out to be a catastrophe for Russia, as well as everybody else. But there is a catch to this. Actually, what Stalin did in 1939 was what conservative advisors to Nicholas II were urging him to do before the First War. If, in both cases, faced by the threat of German power and expansionism, Russia had two basic possibilities. Either you ganged up with the Western powers, France and Britain, to deter Germany, and if deterrence didn't work, to defeat them, or you tried to deflect the Germans westwards, on the principle that the war would go on for 20 years with the British and French. Meanwhile, Russia would be at peace, it could develop its resources, consolidate its political system. My arch hero, the man who started my academic career, who, to the horror of my wife, was the chief of the Russian State Security Police at the time, he was the man who crushed the 1905 revolution. He wrote a secret memorandum to Nicholas II in February 14, saying a European war is coming, it will be a long war, it will test more than armies, the economies and the political legitimacy of the various states. Russia will not sustain that war, and in Russia there is no possibility of a midway. If the monarchy falls, we will have full-scale socialist revolution. And he was right.
Right.
But Nicholas II's regime, for perfectly good reasons, took, in foreign policy terms, the policy of deterrence. Ganged up with the British and French, didn't work. Stalin in 1939 took the opposite.
Okay.
Hold on, wait, I'm just going to finish. And it was a disaster too. Look, the point about this is that international relations is the great killer. Those decisions made by Russian diplomats before 1914 probably in the end killed about 15 million subjects of the Russian Emperor. They resulted in revolution, war, the Bolshevik dictatorship, the whole bloody lot. And now we are back in just that, facing what's happening in Ukraine. That is, in a sense, the Italian invasion of Abyssinia. The big issue coming about in the Pacific is the end of mankind. I finished.
I had a lot of questions.
We were trying to stop you doing that.
But I have to say that one of the interesting things about the Great Patriotic War, if I may be allowed a voice for 30 seconds, is how the casualty figures keep going up. And Khrushchev fixed them at 20 million because of the embarrassment that they were much higher. Under Gorbachev, they went up to 27 million. Under Putin, they've gone up to 31 million. Of course, I don't know what the real things actually are. But that's a footnote. Let's move on to Russian and American exceptionalism. I'd like you to talk about that, Michael, as well, and you, Dominic, about Russian exceptionalism. There's an autobiography of General Mikhail Gromov, who was the last Soviet soldier to leave Afghanistan. Gromov writes that he's lived under 3 different political systems in his lifetime: under communism, under liberal democracy, under Yeltsin, and managed democracy under Putin. And he writes, you know, none of this is important. Political regimes are not important. Politics isn't important. What's important is that during that time he was able to hold his vision of Russia and its special place in history. So this is Russian exceptionalism, which is certainly part of the narrative of the war in Ukraine. Would you like to say something about that? However, before you do, I'm going to ask Michael to talk about exceptionalism in general. There are very few countries now that claim to be exceptional. The United States is one of them, with increasing lack of self-confidence, but anyway, it's part of the national debate, particularly in American election years. Russian exceptionalism is there. Because the first exceptionalism is Jewish exceptionalism, the chosen people, of course, it all starts there. As the great Jewish philosopher Spinoza famously and cruelly said, well, we have to believe or hope that God loves us as much as we love him, because there's no evidence of this in the historical record. However, Michael, exceptionalism in general, is it still alive and well, and does it exist in China, for example? Is this what Xi Jinping's messages and the patriotic history causes? Is it Chinese exceptionalism, or just Chinese superiority and longevity of its civilization?
Well, I think the to my mind, quite depressing thing about China is that something which started under the nationalist government in 1915, they introduced a new day of holiday, called the Day of National Humiliation, which was about all the things, the bad things that European imperialists and Japanese imperialists had inflicted on China. It's not contrary to what you might think. It is very much alive in the present, and it actually started in China in 1915, and then in the 20s they produced what were called humiliation geographies or maps, which were the schools to show the extent of the humiliation where European powers took on the so-called treaty ports and the Japanese around bits of the country. Actually, under Mao, that was not what was wanted as a tool. He was not interested in Chinese history or culture. In fact, he tried to destroy both, burn everything. He was interested in global revolution. He was a global revolution. There's a very, very good book by a woman called Mary Lovell called Global Maoism, which shows you the extent of Maoist activity. I mean, no wonder they've got so many friends all over Africa, because they were great supporters of most of the people who were in power in Africa at a time when the West was backing disgusting governments like the apartheid government in South Africa. I mean, it's not a big mystery as to why the Chinese are welcome so often in Africa, despite all the nonsense you read in newspapers about them being resented and for big countries in hock, etc., and of course they come out with all the money. But apart from that digression, it's only really after the Tiananmen Square events in 1989 that the government, the Deng government, latched onto the whole subject of national humiliation by external powers, because even he, before that, when he once went on a mission to Japan and basically said to the Japanese, look, let's just forget these unfortunate events, i.e. the Second World War and mass murder, let's just forget that, we need to do commercial deals and we want you to help us modernise. But the modern Chinese approach is very much to stress China as the victim of Western aggression. And this comes in 2 forms. There's a form which the government controls, and it's built, I think it's built 10,000 massive war memorials all over China to commemorate these dastardly deeds. 10,000 memorials, imagine that, big ones. So there's the controlled version, which is also represented in films and novels and whatever. But potentially dangerous for the regime is the uncontrolled version, which is the young netizens who are fervent patriots, and the more well-educated they are, the more patriotic they are, especially the ones we get, in Britain as students. These are really ferocious patriots. And this can very quickly tip over into something that the regime does not want. So, for example, if the Japanese do something incredibly stupid, which they're often capable of doing, like Shinzo Abe sitting in the cockpit of a fighter jet, which had a code number painted on the tail, which was actually the code number of the Japanese unit which carried out chemical warfare in China in the Second World War. That number was on the tail of the plane, and he's sitting there going like this in the cockpit, stupid. When things like that happen, then our angry netizens just go berserk, and they'll start burning down every factory which they think is Japanese, but they can't tell whether the characters are Japanese or Korean, so they make a lot of mistakes. That's sort of okay, burn a Panasonic factory down, fine. But it's when those same people go out and tip over the police cars that come along to tell them to stop it and set them on fire, now the regime's got a problem. So it's involved in a very, you imagine China as a very top-down surveillance autocracy, but it's in a dialectic with a lot of the population, and that population can easily get ahead of where the government wants to be. This is not unique. I mean, in Europe in 1914, every country had sort of middle-class, belligerent, populistic societies devoted to building bigger fleets, bigger armies, conquering this, conquering that. And those movements often got ahead of where the government wanted to be and sort of propelled them into being more aggressive. And these constituencies were inherently insatiable. You could cover the ocean with ships, and there wouldn't be enough ships. They were crazy people and very well organised. So the Chinese government has got to be very careful that it always stays in sync with where these people are, because they can really cause it a lot of problems. And if they think Xi Jinping or whoever is being weak, that is not a good place to be if you're General Secretary of the Communist Party and Chinese President. That's trouble time, big trouble time. So let's not forget that. But this also brings up a point I sort of wanted to touch on, which is much more delicate, which is the whole issue of history as identity politics, but it's not really about history in the sense that he and I write it. It's actually about group self-assertion, and it's about telling the version that goes with your group. And this is a disastrous development, in my opinion, in history, that history becomes advocacy for a group, a victim group. And I don't know what, this is an entirely subjective observation which some of you might violently disagree with, but I would think it would be a very bad thing for an individual to be in permanent therapy, going over and over and over whatever happened in their childhood. I just think that's a person, I would never do that, and I think that's just terrible. And likewise, if a nation goes into permanent therapy and considers itself to be a victim all the time, that is incredibly dangerous, and it can lead to a sort of self-righteousness which will lead you to lash out at anybody who gets in your way or controverts it, and that's very dangerous too. If you do think of yourselves as the chosen people, then the implication is the others are the unchosen. And that is a real problem. I will say no more on that one. And then, of course, these things become competitive. I vividly remember I made some films for Channel 4 about the Nazi euthanasia program. I remember once interviewing a woman who had been compulsively sterilised in the mental hospital, and which is quite an old lady, and she's a very simple, sort of ordinary person. And she was going on about, it's so unfair, I don't get any compensation, but they give it to those asocial types and those gypsies. And it was like a competition, and then the Jews get everything. This is from somebody who the Nazis just ripped her insides out, effectively. So that's something that one really ought to bear in mind, the competition between groups. And in the United States, that's in overdrive, the competition between Jewish Americans and African Americans about who's the biggest victim, as opposed to slavery. this is a real competition. And ultimately, of course, it's about political power. Who's got the political power? That's really what's going on with that one.
Thank you. Dominic.
Well, I would just add on to that, Michael, that on the other side of the American spectrum is exceptionalism and decline, which is also a pretty nasty cocktail that could result in some very unpleasant and stupid decisions. And also, I remember when that Chinese group landed on the Senkaku Islands, which is what they were actually carrying the old nationalist flag. And they were people both from Taiwan and from Shanghai who thought that the communist regime in Beijing was too soft on the Japanese. And on Chinese television, PRC television, of course, the old nationalist flag was taken out. But this is no joke, because those far-right people put a big pressure on the German government before 14.
Yeah.
As for Russian exceptionalism, yes. I mean, personally, I think that all great empires, to some extent, think they're exceptional and to an extent immortal. So I wouldn't, it's just my reading of the history of empire, to varying degrees. I also think that in the Chinese case, actually, they have better reason than most to think they are exceptional. Because they were, for a lot of the time, somewhere between a quarter and a third of the world's population, apart from theirs. And they have sustained this great imperial tradition of high civilization. As for Russia, well, the basic point, apart from anything else, is that the Russian claim is a great deal more recent and a great deal more shallow than the Chinese one. Until the 16th century, Russia is a very peripheral end of the failing end, either Byzantine Orthodox end of Europe. So this sense of exceptionalism really, well, it comes from a number. If you're going ancient, it is because the Russians are surrounded by people who are either Latin Christians, pagans, Buddhists, or what have you. In that sense, they were. They were, that's quite true. And that helps to give a sense that your struggles with external enemies are absolute civilizational. That said, the monarchy does bring in all sorts of non-Russians as part of its ruling elite in the cause of Russian power, etc., etc., etc. I mean, what's happening now, and this is absolutely relevant to the regime, is that the acute sense of lost status, a lost sense of one's role in the world. I mean, one is back now with Putin with what's Alexander Izvolsky and Sergei Sazonov said before the First World War. For us, Russia for us is a great power. A great power in those days meant to be one of that group of 5 great states, great communities, which would determine the future of the human race. It meant to be, in the jargon of the time, a people of historical significance as against being mere ethnographic materialism. And if that meant, if you could inculcate that feeling into little Mr. Johnny Meyer, aged 12, in an English, secondary school, whatever school, of course the elites had that to the power of 10. Well, the Soviet elite took that. That is one thing they took on from the old imperial elite. But of course they also linked it to this idea of world mission on a scale that not even Dostoevsky in his mad elite, let alone the imperial ruling elite, the diplomats and senior generals, were much more down to earth, inevitably. And then suddenly it goes far. And almost in the blink of an eye, Russia, i.e. the Soviet Union, is devoted from superpower to bed, overnight. And I would repeat, did I say it this morning or yesterday? Yeah, look, to put this in English terms, you have to imagine that the British Empire collapses overnight in the 1930s, at a time when most English people think that it is both almost part of nature, the natural order, and fundamentally benevolent. You then have to add the collapse of the constitutional monarchy and of the parliamentary system, which is the disintegration of the Communist Party and the Soviet state. You add to that an economic depression worse than the 1930s, which did, after all, among other things, cause a catastrophic decline in Russian male life status. Then you have to add the secession of Scotland and Wales, Belarus and Ukraine, except to repeat what I said this morning, it's much worse than Scotland because no Englishman thinks that the Scots are not a separate people. No one has ever denied the existence of the Scottish nation. On top of that, no Englishman thinks that the English monarchy and English religion began in Scotland because they perfectly evidently didn't. Well, to an extent, in reality, the Russian Orthodox religion and the Russian monarchy did begin on the territory of what's now Ukraine. And really, more to the point, for 700 years by now, the rulers of the Russian monarchy and state have talked about, the fact that they are the same thing as Kiev and Rus. This has been their narrative of history, which all Russians have absorbed more or less, as their mother's milk, and which most older Russians still absolutely do believe. Like all the best historical myths, there's a kernel of truth in it. So there you have the most appalling problems for the Russian elite in coming to terms with the fact that they're utterly demoted and demoralised. And of course Ukraine is going to be the biggest issue for them, because in the first place, Ukraine is not as crucial to the Soviet Union in 1991 as it was to Imperial Russia in 1914. Stalin developed the Ural-Siberia industrial region, which meant they were not totally dependent on Ukraine, which helps to explain why they survived when the Nazis overtook that of Ukraine. Nevertheless, without Ukraine, the Soviet Union was dead. The Russians were going to be left with the Central Asians. Thank you very much. And it was the determination of Ukraine to secede in the autumn of 1991 which kicked the bucket. So you've got all those reasons, and then you have Crimea, of course. And I don't need to go into it all, but on the geopolitical front, losing Crimea means that Russia, for the first time since Catherine II, is no longer the dominant power in the Black Sea region. In 25 years ago, you were the dominant power in Central Europe. You've retreated, so that's hard. And then there's the sentiment. And then there is the fact that Khrushchev was a bloody idiot to give Crimea to Ukraine as an anniversary present in 1954. It would have been better if I was going to say something rude, but Khrushchev saw my face.
We have the dilemma that we've only got 12 minutes more because we have to vacate this room by 5 to 5. We have to be on the bus at 5 o'clock. You have 7 minutes at most to answer one of the following exam questions, and only one of them. First question, is history on the side of democracy or autocracy? Second, where do young people get their history from now? It's mostly social media. The Hitler channel, as you like to call it, the history channel. Conspiracy theories. Thirdly, and last question, which is the one that I always answer, this is John Gray, the British philosopher. The only lesson of history is that we learn nothing from history. Choose one. No more than 7 minutes.
No, 7 minutes. Well, the history of authoritarianism versus democracy is really a question of the day, isn't it? I think, unfortunately, the truth of the matter, there's a very good book I read about 10 years ago called The Dictator's Learning Curve. Dictators, by a man called Gibson in America, Dictator's Learning Curve. And it was, on the one hand, looking at how lots of pro-democracy movements are very organised and learn from each other, so I was very surprised to see that the word enough, when people cry enough, which is rife across Egypt, Zimbabwe, you name it, people say enough. But it was professional technicians of insurgency, many of whom were Serbs, went around, say, to Zimbabwe and taught the opposition how to conduct campaigns and to use slogans like enough. It's a very organised, what Putin and Xi detest as colour revolutions are very interconnected and rely on the same political technologists, I suppose you could call them, many of whom are Serbs. So that was a surprising conclusion. Unfortunately, the other side, as it were, also learns from its mistakes and learns what to do and interacts with each other and borrows technologies. I suspect that members of the Chinese Ministry of State Security go to Russia. In fact, I know one with Xi to Moscow recently, and they will be asking them, well, how do you deal with this? And are there any lessons from how you control the internet? There's a great firewall in China that's suddenly been replicated as the great firewall of Iran, where you block off any internet access from those countries that's not controlled by the regime. And if you think you're being clever by getting a VPN to go around it, you're not being clever because the state surreptitiously controls the sale of the VPN, so you're never going to get away from their. And then we've all our countries, all our democracies have just had the experience with various Israeli companies, notably NSO, selling very high-tech surveillance equipment to disgusting regimes like Saudi Arabia. One day after I'd written a couple of articles in the Times criticising Mohammed bin Salman, and this was before he murdered Khashoggi, this was just because I thought he was a bastard, basically, and his economic policies were no good. I suddenly started getting death threats in Arabic from Saudi Arabia, my face, my byline picture, and then software developed through WhatsApp, which was this NSO software, suddenly appeared on my phone. Had I clicked it open, at that time you had to open it, it would have had access to the whole of my phone contacts. Everything in it would have gone straight away to servers which they could access. Luckily, I'd read an article about some Saudi dissidents in Canada who had this experience and managed to counter it. So that's how regimes, and remember, Israel is nationally some sort of democracy, but it sells all this technology left, right, and centre. They don't care who they sell it to, the revolting people who make it. And there's nothing in the government, in their legislation. In fact, they encourage them to sell it. And it's all stuff developed by the intelligence sector, which has then been brought out into the private sector. Most of the people in the private sector are former intelligence operatives from the cyber warfare units. So there we are, that's that one. So these oppositions and governments learn from each other in a rather depressing way. And history can be reflected in one side, or it can be reflected in the other. And as I'm sure people here know better than I do, someone like Orban would be very much on top of shaping the historical narrative and putting up the right statues or taking down the wrong statues. And that's been going on all the time. So I wouldn't necessarily bank on one side or the other coming out all triumphant. It's like a constantly escalating process. It's rather like cyber warfare itself. It's a constant process of people constantly attacking you, constantly trying to defend. And that's what goes on in terms of history as well, unfortunately.
Thank you, 7 minutes.
Christopher, it seems to me that your first question, which is history on the side of democracy or authoritarianism, and your third question, what, if anything, can we learn from history, are actually in a way the same question. Deeply, deeply embedded still, actually, in the Western consciousness is the sense of modernity having some kind of teleological, etc. It is still the basic idea rooted in 300 years of Anglo predominance in the world, that history has some kind of linear, progressive, content to it, that life is about progress. You can have it, it's basically about progress. It seems to me that the basic Anglo predominance in the world emerges as much as anything after the 7 Years' War, which decides that North America will be Anglo and that the British, not the French, will govern, probably, will be the imperial power in India. And it seems to me that the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, the two World Wars and the Cold War were all attempts to assault that predominance, which failed, most of it, grimly. And we're now at it again. The main difference now is that in the two World Wars, as long as you could engage the United States in the camp of liberalism, you always get a win, because of its vast resources. It's simply vast resources when compared to any other enemy. That's no longer true.
So we are in trouble, in deep trouble. Doesn't mean that democracy is going to lose, but given the splits in America, this is coming back to exceptionalism and decline. Given the geopolitical position, there is a deep, deep, deep crisis we're facing, which will, what happens in Ukraine is important, above all, because it is a test of Western will, but the real decision will be in Asia and the Pacific, I think. As to, do we ever learn anything from history, and this is tied in, but the basic point now is that the great historical narratives, like the one I've been talking about, progress, are deeply questionable, partly for the reason I've said, but the even deeper narrative of progress is to do with the fact that until the end of the 18th century, most perceptions of history were cyclical, because history was cyclical. You went round, you developed great civilizations, high cultures, and then they went bang. And they usually went bang because the economic system could not sustain constant growth. I mean, soon China gets as high as mid-18th century England, it goes far. With the industrial, and Thomas Malthus, when the Industrial Revolution comes along, is the person who is saying this is going to happen to us again. And actually, in the first quarter of the 19th century in Britain, there were moments when, half the 19th century, moments when it looked dicey. The population grows, the resources are no longer adequate, you have external challenges, you go back to where we started. The Industrial Revolution changed all that and destroyed the Malthusian idea that you could not have unlimited progress. And that is the era which we live in and which we have taken absolutely for granted for 200 years. And now we have potentially a sort of god-awful Malthusian crisis on planetary scale. And are we going to overcome it? I don't know. I think we have the technology potentially, whether it'll be the politics, I suspect, which kill us. And if you're actually looking at simultaneously a challenge to 300 years of Anglo predominance and a challenge to the entire post-Malthusian idea of progress, then you're looking at something potentially very, very nasty indeed. And there is no guarantee we're going to survive, and there is a strong possibility that we might at some point at least go back 100 years and have to recover.
Gets even more cheerful.
There's one very quick point I want to make, it's been bothering me for a long time, which is, at what point do things become historical in the sense that none of us feel any emotional investment whatsoever? So, just to give you an example, I spent a year with my wife in a sort of bastion of the Confederacy at Washington and Lee University. The man, even his horse was buried on the campus, and his office was there. And this, the Stonewall Jackson Confederate general was in the cemetery. And this was a crazy year in my life. Virginia Military Academy Institute was there as well. And so history was really live, and I thought, well, that's quite interesting. But then I realised that the town, this is in 2000, was actually solidly segregated. The whole town, and there was not one black student. They were very wealthy Republicans from the South. All the faculty were white, many of them, some of them sort of dementia, but still teaching. And they don't retire in America, it's a gerontocracy in American society, believe me, as we know. But I'm very interested in when do things become history. So, I personally, I don't give a damn about Crassus crucifying 6,000 slaves during the Spartacus rebellion. I'm not an extreme socialist who might weep tears over this. It's just gone. It happened. Get used to it. That was that society. So what? But at what point do things pass into that where we can all just look at it and think, well, so what? Has the French Revolution reached that stage yet? Probably not. It's a very interesting question, this. When do things become just history, and not current politics, not something which defines societies where people have very strong feelings? I mean, lots of people would get very critical of, say, Black Lives Matter stuff and pulling down the statues and all the rest of it. Well, if I was an African American and I looked at these statues, which are all put up 20, 30 years after the Civil War ended, and they have an agenda behind behind them. And then I thought, well, my ancestors, my grandfather could have grown up in a segregated system subject to discrimination. I might feel very upset about it too. So you have to put aside what you think about it, that it's politically correct or it's woke, and actually think, well, what that really means for for individuals in that context.
We really have to. We really will have to go. I'm afraid we have to catch this bus. But before we do that, you actually made a very important point there, Michael, because some would argue that historians long ago able to tell us what is historic, because everything is historical. And what was important about historians in the last 300 years was they could tell you what was historic.
Yeah.
There were so many questions I would like to have asked. And one particular question I wanted to ask is it possible to have history without enemies? I counted up the number of enemies that Putin has now identified. The West, Ukraine, Satanists, gays, drug addicts, militant Poles, militant gay Balts, and gay Poles who dare not declare their gayness in Poland itself because that's even more dangerous than being gay in Russia. Anyway, we can't discuss these fascinating questions and others because we've come to an end. But the good news is that both our historians will be at dinner this evening. I think we'll be at dinner this evening. And please feel free to interrogate them. Please catch that bus now.